and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 173, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
And me, Ravi Abbott.
And welcome to this week's podcast. Now, we do have to say that because I was checking out the stats last week. We've added on thousands of new listeners in the last few weeks.
It's been awesome.
Yeah, probably, we were in Retro Gamer magazine in the last couple of weeks, in the current issue, actually, if you go into your local newsagent. Obviously, Play Expo, all these events that we're doing all over the place as well. So it's always amazing to see new people coming on board and, getting tweets of people going, just discovered your show and I've actually binge listened 150 of them over the weekend. That's pretty
cool. Yeah, you've got 3 years of stuff to keep up with now.
But it's crazy. I was meeting people at Play Expo last weekend who were saying to me, I've literally only discovered the show a month ago, but I'm caught up to date now.
Yeah,
and I'm like,
that's awesome.
You must be sick to death of our voice by now, surely. So, if you are going to any events, maybe this weekend you're off to Pixel Heaven, maybe listening on the plane. I'll be there as well. I'm off to Poland this weekend.
Yep, I'm off to Swag as well.
Yeah, Southwest Amiga Group, and then we're off to Norway next month too. For our first appearance out in Norway, actually, with DJ Slopes is going to be out there as well.
Yeah, my first time in Scandinavia. I hear it's absolutely beautiful as well.
It is a lovely place out there. Yeah, if you want to come out and check us out at any of these events, I'll put links in our show notes at theretrohour.com to where you can buy tickets. So if you are in Poland or maybe you're listening in Norway and you want to come out and say hello, definitely try and make it along to these events, and there's more to come throughout the summer as well. Now, this week, we've got a really cool guest on this podcast every week. Not only do we keep you up to date on what's happening in the world of retro gaming and technology, but also we bring you a really interesting guest. Now, those who have been listening to the show for a while will know that I've got, probably two big loves in the world of gaming. Adventure games, big into them. We did actually a whole month about adventure games last year.
Yeah. Text adventures, point and clicks. You're really into that kind of adventure fantasy stuff.
Well, I love LucasArts kind of stuff. That was amazing. And also the system I collect for is the Atari Jaguar.
Yeah, you see, we both collect for strange CD systems, don't we? So you collect for the Jaguar, I collect Amiga CD32.
Yeah, I've got the CD add-on for the Jag as well. So I've collected all 8 games that were released for that. And actually, because, funnily enough, when we were at Play Expo last weekend, we're with our mate, obviously Joe was there, and our mate Alex as well. Alex is getting stuff for his Super Nintendo. Joe's getting a few Mega Drive things. I'm looking around, I'm like, hang on, that looks like an erotica game for the Philips CDI. Yeah, I'll have that. So, I only buy really bad games these days because I've got all the good ones that I want anyway.
Well, why are we on about the Jaguar?
Well, the Jaguar, it's an interesting system. And there were some good titles released on the Jag as well. And the one that really everyone says was the big system seller back in the day, and a lot of people rate as the best game on the Jaguar, was a first-person shooter called Alien vs. Predator. Now, today on the show, we're going to be joined by James Purple Hampton. Now, he's a really interesting guy. Not only did he kind of do his own kind of live-action game based on D&D when he was really young, which we'll talk about in just a bit, but also then he got into the industry. He worked at Lucasfilm Games, testing games like Monkey Island 1 and 2, and
awesome.
Which, some of the probably the biggest adventure games ever made. And we'll find out a bit about what the process was like in, the development of those games and working there at the time and kind of what changed that development as well, which I find really interesting. And then after that, he worked for Atari, with the Tramiels when the Jaguar was just coming out the door, and he actually worked on Alien vs. Predator, the game that most people do regard as the best title on the system. So we're going to talk a bit about not only developing that game, but the Jag in general as well. And
yeah, stuff like Doom for the Jag was absolutely awesome port. And, just like how the Jag was used, developed, how the actual budgeting was done by the Tramiels and how they looked after certain projects and made sure certain projects succeeded.
And what went wrong,
yeah,
of course, as well. So it's a really interesting chat this week. James Purple Hampton is going to be our guest on the Retro Hour podcast. He'll be on in around 15 minutes from now. And we've got some cool news stories to cover this week as well, including, get your credit card ready, the most expensive retro games console we've ever seen. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. And a game called Hunter from back in the day. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. Loved Hunter. That was the kind of my first free roam.
Yeah, back on the Amiga, wasn't it? I think I came out on the SD
and
original.
SD as well, yeah.
So we're going to talk about a new version of that as well in just a bit. Now, before we get into our news stories this week, at the start of every show, we give a huge thank you to the people who enable us to come in here and bring you the Retro Hour podcast week in, week out. We're into our 4th year of doing this show now, so we've been doing this a long time. And we couldn't get this far without your support. Now, if you'd like to help out the show, everything we earn from it, every penny, every cent, every dollar, every euro, goes back into the running of the podcast, and you will earn a place in the Retro Hour Hall of Fame. Just like this week, we want to say a big thank you to
Derek Murray,
Christian Trengius,
Patrick McGinty,
and Darren Coles, who all made donations into the running of the show. And if you'd like to do the same, we accept it on PayPal, any amount, through our website at theretrohour.com. And also, while we're talking about great supporters of the podcast, our amazing friends at The Economist. Now, they've been supporting the podcast now for months, and honestly, we really appreciate their support. And we're big fans of The Economist too. I mean, they've been going over 170 years, which is, in this world of false news and misleading headlines on social media, getting real trustworthy news is more important than ever. And they cover so much as well. I mean, obviously, you've got the economy and finance in there too, but also politics, business, science, technology, and of course, going in with the show, gaming as well. Now, you were checking out this article about Apple's change in direction.
Yeah, so Apple, they've kind of made their iPhones too good. Like the iPhone 7 and 8 and 6, people aren't upgrading from them. So they're slowing their phone sales. They've sold all the phones to people that they can sell, and they haven't really got a gimmick to go through there. So they're aiming for new areas, which are like game streaming, which we're going to hear a lot about from everybody. And we've actually got a point, a news item that we're going to talk about that. News, but also a credit card. So they want to kind of get in that middleman area, just like Elon Musk did with PayPal,
So, I mean, they've got Apple Pay and stuff like that already, but I think you're right there. It's the fact, I've got a new iPhone. It's like, the camera's a bit better and the screen's a bit brighter, but what else can they do?
It's all about the content now, and I think that's what they're going to be interested in, having these content services. But actually, I think it's going to lead to more of a fragmented market, and there's not going to be a central place where you can either find your game or find your movie. Like, they're not all going to be on Apple, they're not all going to be on Netflix, so it's going to be spread all over the shop, isn't it?
And this article kind of talks about that as well, and also whether the fact that is it going to get the stage where we need to spend about 50 quid a month signing up to all these different services just to get the shows that we want. So that's kind of stuff they cover in The Economist, some really interesting eye-opening articles. And we would like to invite you to get your own free copy of The Economist through your door. Now, if you live in the UK, all you got to do is grab your phone right now for your free print copy of The Economist. Text the word retro and send it to 78070. We've got this exclusive offer just for you, listeners of the Retro Hour podcast. We'd love you to check it out. You'll be really helping out the show as well. Text retro and send it to 78070 and get your own copy of The Economist, the smart guide to the forces changing your world.
My dad actually did this. He wrote, got his copy of The Economist, subscribed, and when he subscribed, they also sent him a power bank.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, which is really cool.
Must have known that's your dad. That's Ravi's dad. We'll help you
there. There you go.
Now, let's get into this week's news stories then. Now, we've been covering kind of these tools to make your own retro games over the last couple of weeks. We had Jonathan Caldwell's amazing package.
Yeah, multi-arcade designer.
We had the NES Maker package that let you make games for the Nintendo Entertainment System. But maybe the NES is a bit too tied down for you. Maybe you like your gaming on the road. What about making games for the original Game Boy?
Yes, that would be awesome. And this is called Game Boy Studio. Now, it's for building actual real Game Boy ROMs, but you can also display them on stuff like your iPhone.
Yeah, this looks insane.
Yeah, play them and export them to all different types of stuff. And also you could build HTML5 versions, which is absolutely insane. So you could kind of have it integrated with a website, or you could have it running on anything that would run a HTML5 browser.
Which is like anything with a web browser these days,
yeah,
isn't it?
Pretty much. If you're not using old Internet Explorer, but yeah.
Yeah, I might not work on my Amiga 1200, but yeah. But that is awesome. I mean, the fact that these tools are coming out now, back then, if you want to make a Game Boy game back in the day, you'd need a dev kit. It cost a hell of a lot of money to make games for these systems.
And you can even flash this. So what you can do is you can get one of these original, kind of flash carts, usually cheap from China, and then you just flash the ROM image onto that, and then just put it into your Game Boy, bang, go, straight away.
So this code can actually run on your original Game Boy from 1989 as well. And looking at it, I mean, it's like these other things we've kind of covered in the last couple of weeks. The majority of it seems to be quite point-and-click driven.
Yeah. And, I think this is really good for anybody learning to code, because if you can do the point-and-click driven stuff and then look further into the code and go, oh, what I've done is actually doing that, then that's the start of a process. That's the start of actually creating something.
Yeah, and how programs are structured and that kind of thing too.
Yeah.
So you're right, you're looking at it and like you do your point and click stuff, but also the code kind of generates on the other side of the screen. So it looks really, really cool. And if you've ever had a dream of making your own Game Boy game, and I love the fact, I could make a game and just email it to you, check this out on this website, I'll put it up there, it's...
Yeah,
that's really cool.
And I guess people can innovate as well, you've got total freedom with something like this.
Yeah, and if you're running it online too, I mean, you can make it, multiplayer games that you can play through browsers.
Integrate HTML5 with that. And then, you've got something crazy. Pokemon Red for everybody.
So if you want to read more about that, of course, we put all of our stories that we talk about every week in our show notes at theretrohour.com. We save you the hassle of Googling. We put it all there for you. And you might be interested in looking at this if you've got a few quid floating around. If you're a bit fancy like Ravi. $2,799. That is how much this emulator will cost you for this. They're calling it the fanciest retro game console around.
It's made by this company who we've covered before.
Yeah.
Artists and craftsmen love Hampton.
Yep.
And I don't know how this guy makes any money. Maybe he makes individual ones and then sells them or something, but this is really weird, actually. So what they have is a 19-inch 4x3 monitor that's actually LCD.
Yeah, it's LCD, but they've kind of warped it to
They've
look
warped
like
it. Yeah, I don't know how they've done that. Bent the screen to look like an old CRT monitor.
Yeah.
I've never actually seen that before, have you?
No, and I don't even know how you do that. Unless you custom made a front panel or heated it up and bent it or something. I don't know.
It must be really weird to look at it, though. But see what it looks like.
Well, inside there's a Raspberry Pi in there, and obviously you can emulate as much as you want on that thing, and they cost like what, 25 quid to buy a Raspberry Pi.
There's a Bluetooth controller to attach your remotes as well, and your games controllers. That's fine. That's cheap.
Well, that's already on board on the Raspberry Pi now anyway. So I think literally what this is, it's a nice looking fancy case. I mean, looking at the build quality, it's all handcrafted wood by the looks of it. It looks like they made this. It reminds me of, when you watch like the Simpsons, the TV they have in the corner of their living room, that kind of old-style American big boxy CRT with the tuning knobs and all that on.
I could see this for like a really trendy company that's just trying to do up their offices or something.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of guys that would buy this.
A Raspberry Pi and a flat screen, you're probably talking about 100 quid's worth of technology in there, if that, aren't you, really?
Yeah, but you could even go down to the charity shop and just stick a Raspberry Pi in an old TV.
Yes. And all the comments on this article are saying that, this guy here is called a Quarterburn. He goes, $2,800, and all you get is a $30 computer with a warp screen from the shell of a 1960s TV, which if you want to boil it down to its essence, you're right. But again, we've talked about this company before, and these are really art installations, aren't they? They're made for, like you said, trendy bars or, maybe galleries or something
People
like that.
with more sense than money, I'm afraid.
Which is not us. I've got no sense but no money as well. So it's good to drool over this kind of thing and check it out, I think,
definitely.
though, isn't it? Now, let's get into this story that I've been seeing everywhere, but a bit of a different angle on this. Microsoft have recently released their new Xbox One without a Blu-ray drive on there.
Yes, so there's an article here in Quartz which is talking about how new video games console will kill the future of retro gaming culture. Yeah. And it's pretty wrong, I think. But what they're saying is, I had a problem finding this Tetris game. The cartridge burnt out, so I had to go to eBay, and then eventually I had to buy it from an antique store. And they're just going to get rarer and rarer having physical copies of games, especially with stuff like the Xbox One coming out. But then we've talked about a great service called Antstream that's coming up, and they've actually got a Kickstarter at the moment and a few stretch goals. So if you check them out, they're wanting to do a streaming service for retro games with added options like league tables, being able to add your friends, do multiplayer on some games that previously wouldn't have had it,
Yeah, they're kind of like, they call themselves the Netflix of video games, aren't they, really, for retro games? I actually met them at Play Expo, really cool company. But yeah, I think, because I've been seeing this everywhere, the angle that most of the media I've been talking about is game collecting. Now you get this discless Xbox One, you're not going to have a shelf of games on there. And for me, I mean, the biggest disadvantage of not having discs is that you can't trade them in, I guess, if you want to do that kind of thing. I think the biggest detriment in the future that this is going to be for is game shops. Because, especially stuff like CEX and Game and, all these stores that rely a large percent of their
On
income.
the second-hand market.
Yeah, the second-hand market. It's going to kill that off. But as we know, I mean, there's already been cases of services that have closed down in the last decade or so. I mean, one example I've got on my hard disk on my Xbox 360, I've got Outrun Coast to Coast, which is the Outrun 2 version, nicely upgraded for the 360. The loss of Ferrari license, so it got pulled after a year.
But it's already happening as well. So stuff like floppy disks, those old, really 5.25-inch floppies, those massive
the really floppy ones.
Yeah, they're already going. Double densities are already going and stuff. And, you know, I collect CD32 games, and I'm well aware that all my CD32 games are probably going to go within the next 10 years.
Yeah.
The CDs won't be readable, but I don't care. I want them box and manual, even if it's got a copied CD in there. It's weird. But I think stuff like cartridges, SNES stuff, NES stuff, that's going to last for a long time, isn't it?
Yeah, as long as there are not batteries inside them.
True, yeah.
But yeah, that's the difference. It's either, you're right there, because often collectors get sealed games and they'll probably never open them anyway.
Yeah. So it's just collecting dust on the shelf. That's all it's doing.
But what I don't worry about is, though, I don't worry about the fact that we might never be able to play these games again, because as we've seen already, I mean, you know, the original Wii servers went down recently, but there'll always be services like archive.org and, you know, the pirates, if you want to call them that, the abandonware people,
totally,
they'll always find a way.
The one thing that happened when the Amiga scene died was that everybody thought all this software was lost. But thanks to the piracy groups and the crackers, there was actually these huge archives. I don't think you can download a piece of old Amiga software now without having a crack on the front of it, you know, because those are the remaining kind of copies. So I actually think they're helping preserve quite a lot of stuff.
Well, I've actually seen commercial releases of old games again that have actually admitted, we use a pirated version because we forgot how to get around our old copy protection. So
there you go.
In the end, that has been the only way. And that's always going to continue, despite efforts like, you know, from companies like Nintendo to wipe it off the face of the earth. It's like, I think there'll always be a way if you know where to look.
And also, like, games companies, they've been sold through so many different groups, different assets, and, you know, they've all been transferred and everything. I think it's going to be hard to erase all the games out of existence because one person hasn't purchased them all.
Yeah.
You know, if there was one big owner that could say, right, no, but there's so many different owners, so many companies, it's actually quite a nightmare to find out who owns a game. You know,
and if you ever can't
who owns the rights?
And if you ever can't find a game, I mean, just drop Ravi a little DM. He'll invite you to his private FTP server.
Yep.
He's going to get loads of them now. I'm joking. I joke, of course. Now,
I have got an FTP, though.
Did that knock on the door? Nintendo's lawyers? Not Nintendo game. No Nintendo ROMs at all on there.
Oh, no.
Now, before we get into our guest, James Purple Hampton this week, let's talk a bit about Hunter. Now, this was a game that came out by Activision, didn't it, back on the ST and the Amiga. Back in, was it 1991, I believe that game came out originally?
Yeah, and it was quite cool because it was in this, like, polygon style, but you could also drive different vehicles. I remember that. I didn't really ever know what I was doing on this game. I was just going around driving different vehicles, crashing boats, and just being at awe with exploring the land.
But you'd never seen anything like it before.
No, it was really, really beautiful. Actually, I'd say the one thing that it reminded me of was Castle Master and 3D Construction Kit.
Yeah.
Because if you ever used 3D Construction Kit, I used to try and build the local market square in 3D Construction Kit, but never had enough memory. Because it was far too big. But it has that look, but it's colour. And it's just got a really nice isometric style, actually.
Well, it's those like very early 90s shaded polygons, isn't it, before texture mapping came along. And, I mean, you know, gameplay-wise, today it kind of reminds me of something like a GTA 5, isn't it? It's walk around, getting vehicles, it's that third-person perspective. Very cutting edge for its time. But now it turns out there's actually been a modern conversion of this game for GZ Doom, which is... So they put this on the Doom engine.
Yeah.
Which is nuts.
And it looks like it looks a lot smoother, obviously, and it's kind of running well. The vehicles are a bit shaky.
Yeah.
But, it's interesting that they're actually porting it. I'd love to see a version of Hunter for modern machines as well, you know. Maybe they can clean this up a bit and get it working even better.
Well, this is a thread on EAB, the English Amiga board, that I'll link up to in our show notes as well. It's about 7 pages long at the moment, but very interesting read and definitely worth checking out if you're a fan of the original game. Right then, let's get into this week's special guest, James Purple Hampton, talking about those days testing out games like Monkey Island at Lucasfilm and then into the Jaguar period at Atari. Really interesting guest, and we will have more news for you next Friday. You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it is time to welcome on this week's very special guest. We're really excited to get stories about massive companies like Lucasfilm Games and Atari as well. Welcome to the show, James Purple Hampton.
Hello, how's it going?
Very good, thank you. Now, before we get into stories of these amazing companies that you've worked at, just kind of going back to your origins and kind of your geek credentials. How did you first get into computers and games? Where did it all start for you?
I guess it all started when I was in probably junior high school. I had one of my best friends, Kevin, had an Apple II at his house and sort of introduced me to the idea of, what computer games could be. So we played a lot of Wizardry, the text adventures, Swashbuckler, a lot of things on the monochrome screen. And then periodically would sneak off to the arcade and play some, coin-op stuff to sort of keep ourselves busy after school,
Would you kind of get lost in those fantasy text adventure games as well?
Yeah, absolutely. We were big fans of the Infocom, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy with the original box and the sort of microscopic space fleet in a bag type of thing.
That game was brutal as well, wasn't it?
It was pretty hard. I mean, in fact, a lot of people got stuck at the Babelfish step just because it was so complicated.
It was quite unfair as well. I remember you some random events of distress. I mean, it's quite faithful to the story, but it was just the way it worked. You'd die in the most unexpected ways.
Right, exactly. We sort of made it as a sort of me and would have a couple friends over, and we all sort of did it together, shouting out answers and trying things out. But made it sort of a kind of a shared experience for us all. It was really funny.
So, which were your kind of favorite titles at the arcade, and what did you have to beat?
The first title that pulled me in was really Star Castle. I don't know if you're familiar. It's one of the Vextrex wireframe games. It's simple, but it did everything in the same sense. 3 concentric rings with this sort of center castle area that you're trying to sort of break through, and it would periodically sort of launch out, fire against you. And it had that kind of cool attract mode where, simple things like the deep bass sound of the blast sort of would echo through the arcade, and you'd sort of wander over. It's oh, what's that? That sort of got me going. But then was immediately drawn to when the Star Wars arcade game came out, the wireframe going through the trenches. It was just exactly what you'd imagined from the movie, and it's really sort of put you there and saw the potential for wow, arcade games can really be everything when you if you put your minds to it.
And those vector graphics, I mean, even now I think there's still something about them that look quite, just different, don't they, to everything else?
Well, really, they stand out, and at the time they really were it had the best sort of tactile feel because they're vector graphics. They, they were really lightning fast, and everything felt solid. If that makes sense, even they were wireframe. I don't know if you remember the original Battlezone with the twin sort of sticks, and that you sort of look through the visor, and that just sort of kind of thing sort of completed the experience. It really sort of set you into it and kind of set the bar for, where to go and why the arcades for such a long time held for so many. What you could get at home at the time didn't quite match up to what you were seeing in the arcades at the time.
I mean, speaking of home systems, did you get a console or a computer yourself then around this time?
I had a borrowed Atari 800 that he and I, my friend, we were knew the people at the local computer game shop, and every so often they would give me a loaner. I was sort of saving up to get the Atari 800, but it did give me, they did let us take it home a few times, and we got to break out, Star Raiders, the, even the basics of original Space Invaders. All that was something we got to explore and really dig into the things like on the Apple II.
And they were good machines as well, the 400 and the 800, the Ataris, weren't they? Very capable.
Well, yeah, and they also worked with traditional game-type controllers and, again, sort of bringing you an experience into your house that was unparalleled at the time. Those original Atari with the 5 1/4-inch floppies and, made it all sort of fit together.
Well, I heard you even made a live-action game based on D&D. Is that right?
Well, right. So I've been playing games all my life. We had a D&D group where we were doing, following the traditional modules and things. But we also part of our D&D sessions, we'd watch some horror movies at the time. And one week, we had really gotten into Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead. So me and my friend Sean, we sort of worked out when the group came over one day, we had created like a sort of a fake emergency broadcast message that said zombies are playing here. And we took the session and turned it into a live playing, zombies are attacking role-playing game where we followed people around the house. It's like, well, they're coming through the window. What do you do? And they're like, well, we're going to barricade it with a table. It's like, there's a table in the room. We'd roll the dice to sort of see what the encounter, did they hit or miss, that type of thing, and sort of basically followed it around. It was kind of an extension of trying to mix it up with the D&D rule base to kind of give us as a guide, but then adding our own elements so we could make it into a zombie hunting game. So
that sounds loads of fun, actually.
Yeah, it was actually, it's like it was one of those things where, oh, well, we shoot them. It's like, well, do you have a gun? Do you see a gun? No. Well, what do you see instead? We sort of left like sort of fake, some props around that you could use as sort of quote unquote weapons, but they had to actually physically go into the room and sort of find where we had put them. And it really added it was, sort of like a haunted fun house, but in role playing form, with dice sort of to determine the outcome. So it was a pretty fun experiment.
And I guess they're always kind of set in moors as well, because that's where you can go and get all the weapons and stuff.
Well, right. I mean, what we tried to do is combine like a little bit of, reality, and we wanted people to think like, well, what would you do in this actual situation? Like, this house has a lot of windows and things. Maybe you should go back to the basement where it's perhaps more protected. But the basement only has one door in and out. Maybe that isn't such a great idea, right?
Well, how did you get into the industry professionally?
By magic and miracle, I would say. I had been going to school. My house burned down. I lost everything I owned, and I had a dream to sort of head west. And so I, realized I could fit all my belongings in a bag. And so I had packed my things and headed west. And when I landed in the Bay Area, I at one point found and it was a blind newspaper ad saying, "Do you have experience playing computer games? We want to talk to you." It was, I think, the one time that Lucasfilm Games had decided to advertise in the paper for testing positions, and I remember getting up. I didn't actually know it was Lucasfilm until the actual day of the interview, where I'm sitting in the lobby going, "What's with all the Star Wars posters?" Right? It was quite a big surprise.
And obviously, there was such a huge company, for adventure games in the late 80s and early 90s. I mean, when you first got there, then, working at this company, what kind of stuff were you doing at first then?
I mean, I got thrown into the deep end right away. So it was the final beta test period for the original Monkey Island. And so right away I started on a Friday, but I immediately came in for weekend testing, where most of the people in the company also kind of gave up at least a Saturday on their weekend to make that big final push for on the beta versions, so that making sure everything's bug free before it finally goes to manufacturing. And it really gave me a firsthand look of both the just the drive and the dedication that everyone in the company had to kind of get it done, and at the same time just what was involved with the actual making builds, fixing bugs, testing them again, and then go, sometimes you have to learn the hard way that even though people know that you're there to do the job, they're sometimes not thrilled to see the tester show up with a crash bug at their door,
And I imagine testing an adventure game, it must be quite time consuming, because I guess you have to go through every different option, all the different answers you can have for every question and everything.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, as I said, I came in on the tail end of Monkey Island 1, but by Monkey Island 2, I was the lead tester, and we developed a pretty hefty tome that we had to break out amongst a dozen testers that basically did exactly that. We test every object with every verb in every room to sort of guarantee that the odd off crash bug doesn't sort of happen. And I think that's the part that really gave me the idea that, yes, testing video games sounds like you're playing games all day, which is pretty awesome. And at the same time, there's a certain level of it's work, because you sometimes have to test the same section over and over and over again until they finally fix the problems that are right. And you sort of have to kind of persevere. It's like, even if you've seen that section a dozen times in a day, you got to be ready for that next time when it's finally correct.
Yeah, I had a friend who did some playtesting for Sega, and at the time, everyone was, it's the coolest job in the world. I think it lasted about a month, and he said, I can't do it anymore.
It's pretty intense work. It really is. And you have to kind of have that spirit of, I don't mind playing this game for the 500th time. And each time you have to kind of challenge yourself not to kind of follow your own habits, each time you have to we always said, break a rule, right? Do something you're not supposed to, because in the end, that's what the actual consumers and people who play it, you can't play your game enough before it's finally released, was the lesson I learned.
Well, you must have played kind of multiple builds and different versions of Monkey Island. Were there any changes that happened that didn't end up in the original title?
I mean, at that stage of the first Monkey Island, the beta was pretty much locked down. So as far as like creative changes or differences, things had been pretty, when you're in development, you reach, there's different stages. Like alpha there is some room for new assets and new materials to sort of come and go. But once you reach beta, everything kind of is on lockdown, and you're primarily just looking for bug fixes, and at that stage, really, it's crash bugs or something that would prevent you from finishing the game.
And one thing I was curious about as well, how did you get the nickname Purple?
Well, when I had that dream about heading west, I was driving a purple marbleized car. So before I headed west, I found a car, painted it purple marble, and got on the road. And at the time when I first started, we all shared like a single Macintosh and FileMaker Pro database, and everyone had like a username or a nickname login. And since I had the purple car and these purple glasses and hair, they were like, you're a purple.
Nice.
So what was it like working at Lucasfilms at that kind of golden era of adventure games?
I mean, I realized how lucky I was. Lucasfilm games there was a certain kind of like, just enthusiasm that everyone had because they were there. And that type of enthusiasm is sort of infectious. People, they rally behind because they realize what they're working on, they truly love, and you can't really polish it enough before it kind of gets out the door. So again, even that first weekend I was working there, what struck me was, wow, these people they mean it, right? They're here on a Saturday just alongside, the rest of the testing department, and going, people, from customer support, people from the art department, everyone sort of stepped up to kind of get involved and give it their all before it finally gets shipped to manufacturing. And that really, to me, was inspiring, right? It's great to sort of be around people who really care about what they're making, and you can and that's, I think, how that golden area, that's where it comes from, right? It comes from lots of people putting a lot of personal time and their own care and interest in it to make it the best it can be.
Well, how closely did you work with legends of Lucasfilm game like Ron Gilbert and David Fox? Did you have much to do with them?
Yeah, I mean, those guys were again, they were the leaders of the company. David Fox was always he was always willing to, as I say, he was this sort of inspiring voice of reason, right? Like, he was very level-headed, but always had these really just forward-thinking ideas about how to do things and really what to watch for. And he really did sort of set the tone for being thorough, but always maintaining that kind of, does it play well? Does it feel right? That's why his game, like Ball Blazer, is such an addictive game if you're playing, especially in the two-player mode. It's like really gets that sense for what's important to the final player, and that's an attribute that's really, so essential when you're trying to get the game right. And Ron was really, he was really open to, he wanted to get people involved. And so in the test department, while we were doing Monkey Island 2, myself and a couple of the other testers, Jim Curran, Mark Cartwright, Brett Mugalewski, we all pulled together our ideas and we created what we called the giant debug or design bug, which contained a lot of, we just did our sort of path section by section of, here's what we see, here's some ideas. Like, so we suggested things like the crazy map that would sort of imitate the Raiders of the Lost Ark, line map, but in sort of a funny way because it's Monkey Island. Or we really wanted to make the card catalog that's in the library room sort of be a true resource. So if you needed virtually any answers to some of the harder questions, you could actually go to the library and find them out, right? So he really opened it up and wanted that type of feedback, and at the right time, of course, right? Like, again, when something's in alpha, there's a sort of a wide runway to sort of make changes and do things, but once it gets locked down, we sort of switch back to bug testing mode and to get it right to the very finish.
When you were testing Monkey Islands, did you realize how good this game was going to be with the cinematics and the soundtrack and the whole kind of package?
I mean, again, that was, for me, coming from the text adventure world, it was amazing, really. It was to see that level of just to make such a complete world. And while it was there, it was also at the time when the first CD-ROM were being introduced. The first version of was an FM Towns version of Loom. I don't know if you remember Loom.
Yeah, great game.
But it was also one of the first ones that had voice actors and voice talent. So, as we used to call them, talkies, like as an old reminiscent of the era of silent movies into sound-based movies, right? Like, it was the first time that we actually had that kind of level of dialogue on into the game, and it really it did, just when you thought it couldn't be better, it's better, right? What a new dimension it added.
I mean, speaking of Monkey Island 2, I remember, that was kind of just before CD-ROMs, became real, like in the mainstream. But that was a massive game. I think I had it on the Commodore Amiga, and I think it was something like 12 or 15 floppy disks. It was like,
oh my God, you're right.
I didn't have a hard disk either. I had to swap them all the time. It was huge.
Yeah, I mean, again, that sort of shows you that sort of era and transition, right? The CD-ROM hadn't even hit the American shores yet. This is pre of that time. And from a testing perspective, let me tell you, the size of the game, like every time you make a new build, what does that mean? You need like another 12 disks. You have to burn and try it out again. And then you think about, you have to make those sets for at least, 6 to a dozen people who are then going to sit there and take it and reinstall it over. So yeah, we all got very comfortable with the eject button with that one,
Disc swapper's wrist, I think, was the syndrome, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly. We used to stack them right by the door, so it's like you could tell people who are really good at, they were really fast. They're like, they could almost do it, I said blindfolded, but
well, what did you think of Monkey Island 2 then as a game?
Oh, I love Monkey Island too. I mean, it's like from my perspective, it was something I was able to be part of from the start to the finish line. And as the lead tester, again, we sort of introduced a lot of sort of thorough tracking so that we could truly have a checklist that we've done absolutely every interaction possible as we went through. And it was like, as I said, 3 binders large, right, that we had to break up into, amongst the department. So I was a lead tester. We had 4 core testers that were always assigned to this title, but during the larger period, we didn't recruit from the rest of the testing pool, other people who had been working on like Indie Action or one of the Indiana Jones adventure game, or the SWATL, or the Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe, the Flight Sim group. Everyone sort of took turns sort of, testing each other's games, even if they weren't officially assigned to that, because you can't ever get enough fresh eyes on something. Each person who's new to it will likely see something that, people who've played the game 100 times that week might miss. And that's, again, something I've learned and sort of kept with me throughout my career, is that you can't, always keep a couple people who've never seen the title around, so that you can first present it to them and see if they get stuck on the most basic stuff, like getting started or in the installation process or the copy protection.
Did the designers or the devs ever kind of disagree with any of the views of the testers?
Of course. I mean, as I said, when it comes down to the technical bugs, the crash bugs, those are obviously, they must be fixed. But when it comes down to content, there's a fine line between, where the QA group starts and the design team ends, if that makes sense. One of the games the testers had been looking at was one of the Nintendo titles, Defenders of Dynatron City. And when it was in a sort of an early alpha stage, we as a test team, who again were all kind of dedicated game players, were sort of lost with where the game was going. We felt the gameplay was pretty flat, and during I think it was Doug Norby, who would periodically meet or have luncheons with each department. And so when it came time for the testing department, we had all been looking at Defenders of Dynatron City. So we decided, while we're eating our pizza, to just sort of discuss what we were kind of our concerns about the title. And we all had another 10-page document with a list of ideas about what could be done to sort of improve it. That didn't go over so well with the devs for that. And I understand that, developers are under a lot of pressure, but they weren't so thrilled when suddenly they're realizing, hey, wait, they need to kind of sort of go back and readdress, the core gameplay mechanics so that it actually, feels like something that you want to keep playing. I guess that was our concern, is that, when it started, it seemed sort of directionless as a player, and we really wanted to kind of step up the action. So that's an encounter where one of the developers got pretty angry, I have to say, and kind of came down, kind of grumbly to the test department, and let's just say words were exchanged. It was kind of a heated moment, but in the end, they realized that people were just trying to make the best game possible, and I think that's where everything sort of falls back. It's like they may not agree, they may feel differently, but ultimately everyone understands that everyone here, even the testers, are trying to make this game the best it can, and let's focus on the work, not not the drama, right?
Yeah, and I guess it's their baby, and they're being so close to it, and I guess it must be hard to take criticism for them sometimes, I guess.
Well, of course, and I think that's why it's like we had the policy, our internal QA policy was, don't just write something like this doesn't work. If you have a valid idea of how it could be corrected, add that into the bug. Put some insight. Give. There's sometimes it is sort of a give and take process, and that's something. Again, the developers at Lucasfilm were really, they were open to that exchange, and that really helped. Sort of just as a whole, they recognize that, hey, we have some input that maybe they're not thinking about, and it does sort of shine a light, and it was nice to kind of see that collaborative spirit sort of carry through to the very end, where for the ending of Monkey Island 2, Ron wasn't quite sure how he wanted to finish it, and so he invited a few of us from the test department to join, him and the Scumlets, or the other programmers who had learned the Scum engine, people like, Tim Schafer and Dave Grossman and Tammy Borowick, all kind of gathered into the conference room where we sort of bantered around ideas, and I suggested what I called the Sane Elsewhere ending, where suddenly the main character wakes up and he's sort of seeing the snow globe of the building, like it's been all a dream. And I think Ron really liked that, so that's why when it ended, you see Guybrush sort of waking up in his room with his older brother, who's LeChuck. Right?
Yeah, I remember my jaw dropped when I saw that as a kid. I was like, no.
Well, exactly, and so it really gives you that kind of like dun 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 type of ending, and it was just sort of fun to see that collaborative process with the Scum team and the QA group sort of coming together and really jamming on what could make it that sort of like signature ending that really gives you the big wow.
And did that ever get properly explained as that ending? As a kid, I remember thinking it was very kind of open to interpretation, maybe.
Well, I in general, it's like they say it's the journey, not the destination, and that's definitely true for most adventure games. I think in that case, we wanted a surprise. We want the fun of playing the adventure games is solving the puzzles and getting there. It's not to say that the ending isn't important, but you want to sort of leave on something where, just give something a bit of the unexpected, so that it's like, wow, that's kind of crazy, isn't it? Right? Like, what were we just seeing? Wait,
Well, after LucasArts, you obviously went on to another massive company, Atari. How did you go from LucasArts to Atari then? What was kind of the path there?
Well, I also learned at LucasArts something that became a truth throughout the games industry, is that the games industry is sort of a high and low business. Sometimes it's high, things are up and everyone's hiring. Sometimes things are low and they're laying off half the company, which is how I got kind of caught up in a company-wide layoff at the time, because they had sort of overexpanded the company. I think doubled in size in less than 4 to 6 months towards the finish of Monkey Island, and I think they had overextended just how many projects were going to be in the pipeline coming up. And so when I left, I actually left and started working with a friend who I'd met at the department, and it was through these friends I stopped at Maxis. I worked at Maxis with working on the original Windows version of SimCity and A-Train and L-Life. And while I was there, my friend Brandy Wilson, who I had met at LucasArts, her sister worked in the business department at Atari and mentioned that they were looking, they were getting a new console ready and they needed new producers. So they hand-carried my resume over, and I interviewed down at Atari, and I was only at Maxis for 6 months to jump at the opportunity to become a producer, at Atari and for the Lynx and the Jaguar.
Well, what stage did you see the Jaguar in development? Did you see any of the Panther at all?
I started in '92, so I saw the original early hardware. The different code names got a little bit confusing at times as to which was which. But for me, the Jaguar exposure was like from when they first started rendering polygons. Like I was part of the original group where we were demonstrating the hardware to a number of developers that Atari had brought in as part of an early sort of Jaguar developer conference that they held on site. And, at the time we just, we were just sort of trying to demonstrate some of the, the texture mapping, the Gouraud shading, the number of polys we could do. And so it wasn't really game specific work, but it was enough to sort of whet the appetite of the development groups that they had brought in. And that team sort of kept on working. I mean, the Jaguar hardware was being worked on virtually to the very finish line before it was launched, and which is why those first early titles were sort of challenged in the sense that there weren't a complete tool set. Like these days, a console developer, if you're making something for like the PlayStation or Xbox, has a ton of middleware or developer tools that you can sort of count on. And the Atari, on the other hand, was pretty much had nothing, like especially at that early stage of things to share or tools to share between the developers. And so each development group was kind of on their own while the hardware is being finished internally, which is both a good thing. That's why you have internal titles to help push the hardware and discover where those where things are sort of the gaps might be. And at the same time, those internal titles still had to get finished and be done on a certain timeline so they could get into manufacturing. And that's a really hard balance to make to work sometimes, as the internal team sort of figured out.
And I guess with Atari having, two consoles, when you did mention the Lynx before as well, which it was actually, it kind of reminded me a bit like a handheld Amiga. It was like a really powerful little system. I know a lot of the Amiga team actually did work on the Lynx too. And I always think, at the time, you've got to think how advanced it was over something like the Game Boy, which I think a lot of people forget.
Yeah, it always, whenever I saw, remember when the Game Boy came out with the Game Boy SP, which was like a backlit full-color display, I was like, it took a decade to finally catch up to where the Lynx was, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And I love the Lynx, and when I first started there, I was assigned to actually sort of track down and produce these titles that had been started by a Chicago office that Atari had that had been closed down. So my first job was actually inheriting and sort of trying to finish a number of these Lynx games, things like Raiden, Ninja Gaiden 3, and actually the actual original first version of Alien vs. Predator was on the Lynx, which where you play it was a two-sided game where you could play as a Marine or a Predator, and it kind of sort of third-person perspective, sort of tracking down through hallways, but the basic idea of having two sides to pit against each other was where it started, and that actually was the basis of the design for the Jaguar team. The original AVP Lynx was being developed by Images, headed by Carl Jeffries in the UK, where you guys are, but it never actually got to completion, as a number of those titles in the Lynx catalog didn't quite make the finish line. But we all agreed that the design was strong enough, and we had this sort of level of license with through Activision. In fact, the original design for Alien vs. Predator was just to be a direct port of the arcade version, which I think you can get on the Super Nintendo, where it's kind of like a Final Fight game where you're playing a Predator punching out aliens as you go. It's fun to play in the arcade, but we always felt that, hey, this is a new console. We'd all been playing things like Wolfenstein and Doom, and we really wanted to, that was, gave us the opportunity to give them a reason to put a new design in, as the original design had all these elements from Dark Horse Comics that we didn't have the license for. And so that was what I call the wedge from our legal team to see, hey, we have a new reason to put in a new design, which was the first-person three-sided game that we came up with.
Well, Atari was kind of like a family company then, with the Tramiels running it. Did you have any interaction with them and work with them at all?
Yes, I worked and reported directly to Sam Trammell for most of my time there. I look back now, and even at the time, I recognize that it was a special place. Atari really has, the unique it did feel like a family. They did look out for each other. They sort of bickered amongst each other sometimes as a family, which is kind of funny to see sometimes, right? It's like you could tell that, Leonard Trammell, who was the sort of a technical leader at Atari, and Sam Trammell, you could tell they were brothers, right? They interacted in the same way that me and my brother may have interacted a little bit, and that kind of thing sort of made it, really interesting. I would say there was a certain level of chaos, but the same chaos that made it kind of, challenging at times was the same chaos that made it really the opportunity at that time to sort of, take things and run with it. And that was what Sam Trammell let me do when I really pressed to sort of put some really focused effort on making Alien versus Predator the best it can be. He really got behind that note. He understood the value of, it wasn't enough to have the title just come out and be a C grade title. It really needed to shine. And if it needed extra time, if it needed extra money, and if it needed, extra cart space, he was ready to make that happen. So I'm always very thankful that he was ready to learn and be open to, what's good for the game, what is good for this company. And that really, rang true.
And that obviously paid off. I mean, even today, I think that game, Alien vs. Predator, is generally regarded by most people as the Jaguar's finest title. I mean, you've kind of touched on some of the background on it, but what's kind of the process of that game and in the development? I mean, how did it kind of progress, and was it always intended to be an FPS game? And what was kind of the process of developing that game? Did it take a long time?
I worked on Alien vs. Predator for 23 months as a total. The Jaguar development probably took 18 of those. My first initial run, as I said, was picking up the Lynx title version of it, and then sort of digging into what we could do with it, as we recognized that yes, it was going to be a lead title for the Jaguar, but at the time, no one was quite sure what that meant. When Atari had the developers conference, I first was introduced to the team at Rebellion, and they seemed to have a really strong artistic sense of like what could really make it sort of stand out. And they were the ones who pitched the idea of actually doing the technique of using model parts to create the background and texture layers, and use it for the animations that I would be sort of photorealistic, which at the time again was sort of unseen in other titles, and really sort of help raise the bar for what we could expect out of the Jaguar as a machine. The process was, there's a lot of back and forth, let's just say. Again, we had sub-licensed it from Activision, so I worked with Tom Sloper, who was really helpful in getting me in front of the people at 20th Century Fox. And to my surprise, they were actually open to the idea. They wanted to see what we wanted to do with the characters, and they ultimately said, yes, make it, if you guys think this three-sided game as a first-person perspective, we're willing to shift the license as long as it says Alien versus Predator on it, and you guys are true to the characters. We'll let this new design to proceed. And as at the start when we were talking, we at Atari, there's a lot of people who are diehard fans, myself included, and we ended up doing a series of movie nights over Ted Takeshi's house, one of the other producers at Atari, and where we all as fans sort of got together and watched all the Alien and Predator movies, and would sort of write down all our ideas, and as the collaborative brainstorming process where you sort of go wide, if you will, about what's our dream or wish list of what we want to include. And that's how we revised the design proposal that was submitted to Activision and 20th Century Fox, and then handed on to the folks at Rebellion, who were able to start building the Jaguar version of it.
Well, I think there were some really good design features in there that were kind of based on atmosphere. And if you look at the Alien films as well, they're very atmospheric, and especially Alien vs. Predator. The early Alien games, like Alien 3, they were all side-scrolling kind of platformers. How did you change this and reflect that atmosphere with a limited draw distance? and frame rate as well.
Well, and frame rate and cartridge space. I mean, honestly, one of the aspects of Alien versus Predator that I'm not sure everyone like. To me, I always like to say the third dimension in games is sound. You know, not that things are 3D rendered, but the actual completion of it. And the audio of Alien versus Predator was led up by the internal audio lead, James Grunke, who helped, working with the other folks like M. Stevens and Wiley. They all put together, they really understood what we were aiming for, which was a horror-based game that could take use of the, we don't have a CD-ROM to expand on to add like dialogue, full-on dialogue, but what we did have was enough to sort of set the stage and really get that atmospheric sense that you're in this deserted space station, and how important that, like, if we were only going to have voice samples, we're going to make those be really important aspects of it. And then I would say 6 weeks out before we were finished, about to reach the final beta stage, we were having an issue with trying to get all the animation into the 2 megabyte cartridge. And again, this is a moment where Sam Trammell, he got behind what we were saying to him and gave us let us expand it to basically double the cartridge size, and we spent virtually all of it on the audio, which allowed us to have the full narrator voice of this computer, which was Richard Miller, who was one of the core architects of the Jaguar design. His wife Sandra, she also worked in there at the office and had this great voice that we heard. We're like, wow, she should be the computer. Yes, come on over. Please record these lines. And again, that was like the spirit of the thing. Everyone wanted to sort of help and sort of collaborate onto it. So we, let James Grunke and his audio team sort of take it and run as far as like, putting as much audio as we could in which to me sealed the deal. It's really sort of, when we got that expanded audio stuff working, it was like it really sort of brought it all together and made it into the kind of game that we fell in love with as we're making. So
and one really innovative thing about that game is you could actually choose whether you wanted to play as the Marine or the alien. Did you have a preference when you were playing the game?
I mean, the complete experience is the Colonial Marine. That has probably the most story, but my personal favorite is the alien, playing as an alien, just because of the mechanic of you're constantly spawning. You have to always be reaching out, infect another Marine and use that as your sort of advance point or your save game point to kind of fall back to if you get killed. And it really sort of added another dimension to explore this idea that, who's, to an alien, it's those Colonial Marines who are the enemy, right?
Yeah.
If you're the predator, who's to say which side is the good guys, if you will, right? And as a I've always loved horror movies. I've always loved sort of like mixing it up. I like the idea of a multi-sided conflict, and which is why I'm really glad that, again, Sam Trammell was able to give us extra time to finish. The title was meant to be I think it was meant to be released in spring of '94, and the original budget had been spent to get the game to, like, I'd say a demo state where, the maze was randomly generated. You could only play as the Marine. And at the time, I know, the folks at Rebellion were itchy to sort of like just ship it, as it were, because they had to move on to other projects. And as I said, the development budget got spent. But after really discussing it with Sam and realized, he understood that the press at the time and the potential for what this title could be and what we could make out of it if we, if we brought the main programmers over to the Atari offices and work on site in Sunnyvale to get the game finished during the summer and really get it ready for a Christmas release, that window gave us everything we needed to actually get all, the original design we'd hoped for, which was all three sides, and sort of playing this really just a different way of doing things, and without that kind of extra bit of runway, the game would have been a single player, one-sided experience and not quite what we were hoping for. I'm so glad that we were able to finish it the way we wanted to.
Well, Alien Isolation is a new kind of VR title where you're hiding away from the aliens and you've got to move around them on the ship. I remember they had a Jaguar VR system at one time. Did you ever try it, and were there any plans to do original AVP in that?
It had been discussed. I never actually tried the prototype hardware, and I had left Atari by the time they were ready to start showing it. I I had seen quite a few of other VR setups at the time, like from a few years before. I had worked at when I was at Lucasfilm. They participated in something called Cyberthon, which was one of the held at the Colossal Studios in San Francisco, where it was like the most early basic prototype versions, like, you know, that they used like a Nintendo glove that they then put on this giant helmet thing that you had to sort of like have a couple people hold on to while you had your head in it. It was like really primitive at the time, but you know, I know that that's where they, you know, because the Game Boy Advance had the 3D sort of module version of it, that there was some talk to get it there, but my focus wasn't on the Jaguar VR. As far as the CD, you know, what we wanted to do for the expanded versions of Alien vs. Predator, we did do sort of an end of post-mortem meeting of here's our wish list of things that didn't quite make it, which turned into about a 5-page document that we submitted to 20th Century Fox for, you know, what we would do with the title, with the, you know, if we could move it onto CD-ROM, and that was in turn became the Alien vs. Predator game that came out from Rebellion like about 4 or 5 years later.
Were there any plans to release that on the Jaguar CD then? Because that had a CD add-on, didn't it?
It was, but again, at the time, the negotiation for actually getting that title made wasn't in place. So the paperwork, you know, the actual legal agreements to actually get that the CD version established didn't get set up, and I left the Atari about 6 months after the original Alien vs. Predator on the Jaguar had come out. So while I handed all the design materials and what we had learned from the original one, you know, its movement into the CD side of it didn't, you know, I wasn't part of.
Did you see any kind of unreleased games or anything that they had in the works that didn't reach the light of day?
Yeah, I mean, the internal projects that was started at the beginning, there was a notion that, again, sort of an old-fashioned way of thinking, that we had 4 lead programmers in the group, and I believe, you know, there was a thought amongst the Atari hardware team that, oh, that means we can get 4 new games out of them in 4 to 6 months, which perhaps that might have been true in the Atari 2600 era, but wasn't definitely true in the you know, in 1990 or 93 when it was being built, or 94. So there were quite a few titles. We had a couple of titles, like about a few months into that process, we all agreed that we should consolidate, pick 2 of the, you know, focus on 2 games and started trying to make 4. So the 2 that got sort of scrapped one was a side-scrolling title that was you know, our rough name was Space Pirate, which was again sort of just a more of a Final Fight shooter type Metroid game where you're in a spaceship sort of shooting through things. That team got sort of moved into what would into another title, and another programmer, John Wentworth, had this really sort of really forward-thinking and probably ahead of its time game where you used sort of hand motions and hand gestures of Sanskrit letters to sort of interact with a sort of underwater exploration game.
Wow.
And it, you know, really, I would love to see that in kind of using the modern VR tech tools, again, sort of ahead of its time. We couldn't really render the world that he saw, but it was really an inspiring game. It's kind of reminiscent of what I'd see in things like Journey or Flower, that really sort of unfolding, not quite what you expect as a game, but is a game, you know? It was really great to see that kind of innovative thinking at play, and I always regret like that not seeing the finish line, but I don't think the hardware at the time would have ever done it justice. But, you know, John Wentworth, if you're listening, get your idea made, man. We want to play it.
Well, what did you think of, like, you know, third-party Jaguar titles that you were seeing released around that time?
So Bill Raybach headed up a lot of the third-party groups, and so, you know, we were thrilled to death when he secured the deal with and worked with id Software to get Doom made. So for us, you know, even though we were making what might be seen as a competitor to Doom, because we're both first-person shooters, you know, the AVP team enjoyed seeing the builds of Doom, because of course that's something we'd play on our free time too. So
and it was a great port, wasn't it, on the Jag?
It really was. I mean, you know, that they did a really, I thought, excellent job. And, you know, and while there were a number of people in the computer world who had been exposed to, you know, the early Wolfenstein and Doom, it was nice to actually bring it into a home console, because, you know, the bar between a home computer and a console was still, you know, could be easily $1,000 or more. And so it was nice to kind of think that, oh, wait, we can bring this into people's living rooms and not just the home computer, and give them a ride that they won't forget.
Well, one thing that kind of overshadows the Jag today in many ways is that whole "was it really 64-bit" argument. Where do you stand on that?
Even at the time, I felt it was kind of, I didn't really understand this kind of, I don't know what you want to describe it as, a stat race or something. This has better stats than that. I never saw things that way. I always saw things like, you're not going to be playing the stats of this hardware. You're going to be playing the games. Are there better games for it? Like, to me, I sort of like, fundamentally, it matters not what we're playing it on, but what we're making instead. And for me, is that the Jaguar titles did have offer things that weren't available in the home world, like a fully 3D environment, even in the pack-in game like Cybermorph was, while it wasn't perhaps fully texture map, did offer a full truly 3D experience with fully rendered ships and enemies, and again and putting that into a home console, even in its most primitive state, was still groundbreaking at the time. You just didn't have that option, and for most titles, or as a home consumer. So when I saw the do the math commercials, and it wasn't, I always like, wait, why are you focusing on these details? I know it sounds good, right? Bigger, better, more, right? But really, when it boils down to it, it doesn't really matter how much of stats you have if the games aren't any good. And so really it needs to come back to, are we offering experiences that you can't get elsewhere? And to me, the answer was yes. Titles like Alien vs. Predator. I was always a huge fan of Iron Soldier, the 3D sort of mech warrior game that was led by another producer, Sean Patton. Sean Patton was who you see as his photograph is the photo of the Marine you see in the upper left-hand corner of the Marine game in Alien vs. Predator. He was one of our diehard fans who actually had made up a full-on Colonial Marine weapon set and armor set that we were using to sort of base the photorealistic textures on. And he really had a good sense for what would make for a great mech game, and that became Iron Soldier, and really did. You're walking around this city and you're able to take down a building in full 3D. It's like, yeah, we brought that home. And if it's 64 bits or what have you, it's like that the gameplay is really what mattered there, and kind of offering people something that they've never been able to do at home before.
Do you still own a Jag at all? And have you kept up with any of the recent developments, like the Pro controllers that guys are releasing and stuff?
I haven't. I haven't picked up the Pro controller, but I do have the original Jaguar. In fact, I have the original sort of pre-prototype, pre-release hardware, and the original breadboard that has the final approved version of Alien vs. Predator on.
Oh wow.
On it. So I've been dusting that off, and I think since it's the 25th anniversary of the Jaguar, I'm thinking of eBaying it perhaps as a pack with all the original level maps and all the a crew T-shirt, some of the materials that we all had at the time, that just sort of put it together as sort of a care package, and just put it out there in the world. If the collector community wants to have at it, then I'm ready to send it out into the world and see where it goes.
You'll have to send me that link as soon as it goes up.
No, I absolutely will.
I mean, personally speaking, I'm a fan of the Jaguar. I've talked about it on the podcast before. It's actually the only system I really collect for. And I'm not far away from a complete collection for it now. And I think, I often felt that, especially the stuff people are doing, like the homebrew community now, it was actually capable hardware, but I feel maybe like a lot of developers didn't utilize it to its full capabilities for whatever reason. Do you think that that's true, and do you think it doesn't really deserve this kind of bad reputation that it seems to have today?
I mean, the bad reputation might have stemmed from, and this again, like what I had mentioned before, the Jaguar never came with a giant tool set for developers to start from. So everything had to be developed from scratch, and when you think about how modern games are developed now, and that there's full on, there's the Unreal Engine, there's the Unity tool set, all this middleware that people have that takes a huge amount of developer cycles. All that means that the developers don't have to build that from the start. I think it can't be underplayed for. I think a game that made it to the finish line on the Jaguar was cutting edge, and really was, because it got finished, right? It wasn't an easy system to build for, because it didn't come with a complete library of developer tools that people have, that was part of like the modern PlayStation development kit, for example. So any developer that sort of signed up to make one, they were kind of taking on the extra challenge of having to literally work with the hardware and develop everything from scratch themselves. I oversaw the group at Lore Design when they were making the Highlander, the animated series CD-ROM game, and that was one of the first motion capture games on a console, and that team had to actually work out how to actually process and manage all the data that you get from the motion capture sessions and put it into a format that could be scalable to the Jaguar and the home console part, which, motion capture is a great way to get that fluid motion, but it actually gives you like way too much information, if you will. So it was like the simplification process on the exact correct joints, that the team worked out that could actually then have it render it out with the limited rendering capabilities of the hardware at the time.
I guess that's one thing like the fans have kind of picked up on, over the last 20 odd years, they've kind of figured out how to use the hardware now to its full capability. That's why I guess you're seeing good homebrew stuff today.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing that that the community has sort of risen up and found a path to do things with. And, I think if we'd had that approach at the beginning, it would be of interest to see what would have happened then if we had opened it up to more people. But again, that kind of, this is almost pre-internet, right? So when this was being made, while there was some email and web browsers, it still was 1993 and 4. I actually, there wasn't an internal, say, network at Atari. People did things what I called the sneaker net, right? We put it on a floppy and carried it over to the desks of the person they were trying to get it to, right? So it was kind of, now I sound old, right? I remember when we had to walk our data down.
This was all fields.
Well, what are you up to nowadays, and what have you kind of been doing since Atari?
Well, after Atari, I worked at a number of console companies. I went to Rocket Science Games to create this game, Pest, which I was able to secure the rights to after it left. So it might be the last game I ever make, but I'll be making it someday, right? But I then moved on to working with Cyclone Studios. Actually, and the developers at Lore had sort of created a sort of a spin-off group that we put together using a Net Eurosi box that we pitched to Sony in London in '97. I don't know if you remember that, but that was the sort of $500
Black
sort of developer-friendly.
PlayStation 1.
Yep,
Yeah,
for PlayStation 1.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which again, it's like people seem to forget that at the time those development kits would cost anywhere from like $30,000 to $50,000 just to get a single developer kit. And so the Net Eurosi really was an approach that was I thought it was fantastic, right? For the cost of effectively about $500 or $600, you got almost a full development kit, which was one step away from being a full-on dev board, but enough to actually, put a game together. And we actually, put a playable game that we pitched to Sony in London, and and that side worked out. Unfortunately, the team, the wheels of game development move slowly, and so that developer ended up taking a contract job, and I returned back to the United States to work at Cyclone Studios, which then got bought by 3DO. So I helped design the Army Men Air Attack game, where it was kind of, you play sort of a helicopter game, but I really wanted to push the toy aspect and sort of pursue that sort of cartoon sensibility. I worked at Shockwave.com, so that was one of the, I would say, the transitional period between like 56K modems and standard high-speed internet. I remember starting, and the bar was, the game has to be 500K or less, which was like kind of it was kind of an unspoken rule. But even while that period was going on, we've noted, the way people were reaching the access to the internet, changed. The days of the 56K modem dial-up was transitioning over to more standard cable modems, and so we were able to sort of expand into a new style of game. In recent times, I have been, I've sort of moved towards an educational bent for a while. My sister had my niece and nephew, and I really kind of thought, let's, maybe do more, maybe make a fun game that you can also learn your math tables on or something, right? And my core was it didn't need to, the games were still needed to be games that were fun to play. So, you couldn't treat it like the curriculum part shouldn't be broccoli, right? Like it should still be a fast-paced, fun-playing game, but you're still has an educational component. So I was really glad to be able to integrate that aspect of things, and all the while I sort of typing up my notes about, what it was like to work at Lucasfilm and Atari during the days in hopes of, one day I'll get it together in finish form and try to put it out as a book perhaps.
Oh, that'd be incredible. I mean, James, even in the last hour, I feel like we've covered so much, and I think we could easily do like another 2 or 3 hours with you. So it would be amazing to read those stories in a book. So we appreciate you coming on this week and sharing your stories, James. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Oh, I appreciate you guys calling. It's always good to see. And it's great that the Jaguar has such good fans even after all these times, right? It's it's kind of an odd time in video gaming, but it was also it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, right? Like the chaos that made it bad also made it awesome, and I was really glad to be able to work with and collaborate with the people I was able to build these games with, and it's great that people remember them after all these years.